I'm recording now. As usual, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me at any point. The recording is only of my microphone and um, my screen down here, so you guys are not part of the recording. So I'll get started. So we're looking at nested loops today. So we're taking the loop, and nested means when one thing is inside of another thing. And so that happens a lot in programming, writing HTML, CSS, all these different languages involve nesting in different ways. And it really just means putting one thing into another. So if we have a loop inside of a loop or an if inside of an if statement, these are referred to as nested statements. And so with the nested loop, the thing that we can do, there's just a few examples here, and then I'm going to go over to P5. Um, so this example just shows what happens in a nested loop over time instead of all at once. Even though the code will run this instantly, we can look at what this looks like on its own. Let me get my brush open. Let's see. Sorry, I'm having a little error. There we go. Okay. Okay. So what we can see in this code is a nested loop. And so we have the loop that we've been using for the pattern for the last couple of assignments. We have let x equals 0, x is less than or equal to width, and x plus equals 100. So that should be somewhat familiar. But then inside of that loop, we have another loop. So this is one loop, and then we have another loop right here. And this loop looks very similar, but it's using the y-axis instead of the x-axis. So we start y at 0, we go y is less than or equal to height, and then y plus equals 100. And when we put these loops together, what we get is a grid. So if I run some of this code, so I'm just going to loop here, that's the first instance of our loop. So what's happening there, so we have x equals 100, we have x equals 0, y equals 0, and so we're in one loop, and inside that loop is another loop. And so that's where our first ellipse is, right here, x plus 50, y plus 50, so that is this point right here, but the x and y value is 0, 0. So that's the first iteration of our loop, and then if we go again, so what happens is we iterate with our nested loop first. So y plus equals 100. So we get that second circle. X is still 0 because right now we're still inside of this loop. So we're going to keep looping through the nested loop. And then when we finish, we go back to the original loop. And by using this structure, we can create a much more complex drawing. So I'm going to loop again. Again, y plus equals 100. So that gives us this coordinate here. X is still 0 and y is 200 now. So we're moving down the page because y is getting bigger each time we go through that inside loop. And if we loop again, now, once again, y is plus equals 100. So we get to 300 down here. And that's the end of our first loop because now if we go again, it would be somewhere down here, and that would be greater than height. So that first parameter would be false, or the conditional statement here is false. And so what's going to happen, and we go again, is now we finished this interior loop because this condition is false. And so now we go back to the very beginning. But we're still in that first loop. So now we do our x plus equals 100. So we looped 4 times through our inside loop, and then we go back to the exterior loop, and we do that again. But now our interior loop starts over. So for each x equals 100, we're going to do another y 0, and then each one of our y positions. So we're going to go through each one of those. we hit the end of our interior loop, and again, we go back to the beginning. So by using these two loops together, we can create an entire grid. And so that's what a nested loop does. It doesn't have to create a grid. There's other ways that we can use it, but that's a basic example for what we can do when we put one loop inside of another. You could even do this in a third dimension. You could make a 3D grid if you wanted to, but we'll stick with the 2D for today. So that's one way to use a nested loop. There's a couple other visualizations here. These are kind of offset. Um, I don't know why those numbers are in the wrong place. I wonder if my CSS is off. That's okay. It's not that big of a deal. That one works. Okay. I don't know why that one works. Um, Here, it's just a little visualization of what the grid looks like. So we have our nested loop here. We start with our condition x equals 0. So we can see that x condition is where the left side of our grid starts. If I move it up, it's going to move across the page. If I move it down, it's going to move back. Then the x is less than or equal to 500 is how many columns basically we're going to go through with our loop. And then the plus equals 100 is how much space there is between each column. So for x, we're basically setting the number of columns in our grid. For y, we're setting the number of rows. We tend to go X and then Y because we always talk about X first and then Y, but you don't have to do it that way. You could put an X loop inside of a Y loop, and either one of those would be fine. So what I'm going to do now is go over and demonstrate this using the examples that we've been doing in the previous versions. And then we'll also take a look at Janae's example. So I'm going to go over to P5. And I'm going to open the sketch that I made on Monday. Or actually, I'm going to skip this one and go back an extra step to, where is it? Custom function example. Okay, so I'm going to update this one. So I'm going to go to File and click Duplicate. And I'll just rename this real quick. So I'll call this nested loop example. And in this example, I have 2 rows of my little frog characters. So that's the pattern I'm creating. So I'm going to take out some of these comments and just clean this up a little bit. And so what I'm going to focus on is my or my pattern function here. So I set this up so I have these 2 different rows, but I don't need to do it that way. I have 2 loops here, and essentially one loop is basically doing the first row, and the second loop is doing the second row. But if I put one loop inside of the first loop, I can repeat all of the actions of the first loop in my new loop. So again, what loops are useful for is repeating stuff. If we have something that we want to do more than once, using a loop is a way that we can repeat it. We just have to figure out what changes from the first loop to the second loop. And so I'm going to ignore the color for now. I'm just going to put the color up here just to kind of simplify things. I should just use tidy. Oh, but that opens all my functions. Okay. I should change this nested loop example. Okay. So I'm going to ignore the color for now, just to make this a little simpler. And I have this like random face size. I'm just going to throw that into my frog function just to make this a little bit simpler as well. Let's just throw this in here. Okay. Uh-oh. Oh, I got rid of the face size, so let's just change this. Okay. So this is a much more simplified version. But we get basically the same thing. Maybe I'll fix the color later. So I have these two loops, and the only difference between these two loops is the y position. This first one is at 150, and the second one is at 300. And so essentially, I can create a loop to repeat that inside of my first loop. So I can say for, and I want to start at 150, so I can say for let y equals 150. Then I have to decide how many of these do I want. So I can say, well, I'm going to go to up to 300. So let's just say y is less than or equal to 300. So we'll keep going through this while loop as long as it's less than or equal to 300. And of course, we can change that in the future. So then what's the difference between these two? This one is at 150 and this one's at 300. So the difference is 150. So let's just go ahead and add that. So say y plus equals 150. And then I just put some brackets here. And now I can move my frog in here. And now what's different is I have this y variable that's changing. So I have the x here, and now I can just put the y here. And there we go. Now we've got a bunch of extra frogs, so I can delete this loop here. And actually, let's put this whole thing into the frog, the random color as well. So there we go. We don't have to worry about any of that stuff. We just have our basic nested loop and our frog. So now I can change these parameters, as I mentioned. If I want more frogs, I can, or if I want more columns or rows. So for the columns, that's going to be the x value. So if I want more of those, I can decrease the distance between the columns. So if I say x plus equals 50, I'm going to get a lot more frogs because I have less distance in between. If I say 75, get a little bit more. If I say 80 or 100 or 200, or if I just want a couple, I could say 250. So I can change these parameters to fit where I want my grid to go. If I want the grid to move over, I can change the starting point. So I can set x to 200, and that'll move me over a little bit. Um, and I can do the same thing on y. If I want to move actually up a little bit, I could say y equals 0. So now I have 3 rows. I could say y equals 200. So now I just have 1 row. And so using that grid, I can kind of control, or using these parameters, I can control where the grid goes. So what's happening essentially is that I am basically taking these two variables, and instead of like changing them line by line, I'm using this big for loop to change them according to the rules in the for loop. And then I'm doing the same thing with my y for loop. So let's move these back to like 100 and 100. And maybe I'll do plus 100 for y, plus 200 for x. So now I've got a nice little grid. And of course, I can draw other stuff in here. I have my frog, which is kind of nice, but let's say I wanted to draw like a background behind each frog. I could put a rectangle and use the same coordinates. I could say x, y, and then I could use the distance. So the x's are 200. I could say 200 here, and the y's are 200. So now I have a little background. Maybe I can fill this in. Well, it's kind of cool with the different. Oh, but I have okay, let's change this to rect mode corner. Uh, oh, because I'm drawing the frog from the center. I see. So we actually have to draw. So we have to do like x minus 100 to move the rectangle over, and y minus. Oh no, x minus 50. Or no, x is 200, so we should say x minus 100. Y is 100, so we say y minus 50. Not really sure. think because I'm doing something weird. Yeah, I'm doing rect mode center here. So let's move this up to setup so it's on the whole time. And then try just X and Y. Okay, there we go. That's better. Anyway, point is I can add other shapes in there. I don't have to just have my frog. I could design the whole pattern directly in here. So I could have like a rectangle. I could do, let's do a random fill so we can see the difference between the rectangles. So I can have some rectangles, I can add, triangles or lines, whatever I want to throw into the grid, I can throw in there, and I just use X and Y to basically determine where they should go. Um, Janae, did you have a? Uh, that's okay. That's okay. No problem. Okay. Um, so let's look at Janae's example now, because there's going to actually be two different ways that we can add in uh, nested for loops here. So um, I think actually, let's see. I'm going to make a copy of this and just move things around a little bit. So I'm going to duplicate this one. And let's see. I'm going to get rid of the slider for now. Or maybe I can just move it down here. Okay, there we go. Okay, so in for the pattern example, Janae, you had actually already added the columns and rows, but just by doing it manually. So let's look at how we can turn this into a nested for loop. And then the other thing is that you also have you have a for loop for your circle because you have your circles going inward, like they're getting smaller. And we can actually use a loop for that as well. Instead of adjusting the X or the Y, we can actually adjust the size because it's changing at a regular number. Um, so let's see, I'm going to organize this code a little bit. I can take this first circle out and put it in the global scope. Uh, and let's move this over just a little bit. Um, and then, okay, so then you're calling the second circle, but the second circle function is the same as the first circle function. So if you see that, if you make a function like this and the code is exactly the same, you don't need to make another function for that. You can just call the first function. Um, the thing you have to do is change the size, right? That's what the only thing that's different here is this 75. Um, oh, so actually that's kind of interesting. I see what is happening with this because you're drawing each circle. Okay, so we're gonna have to, let's see. So then third circle, fourth circle, fifth circle. Yeah, okay. So this is a really good example. So basically, this circle is actually drawing both the X and the Y. Because in the function, all of these X's are the same. So that's each column going across. But the Y is what's changing here. So this Y, this Y, this Y, this Y, this Y. And those are changing just by 50 each time. So what we can do is change our pattern function here to add in the Y's. And then we can get rid of this part of the loop first. So let's do that part first. So let's make a new function. We're just going to call this circle, which is already a circle function. What should we call it? Let's call it circles because there's multiple circles. And we just need to know the X and Y of the circles. So we'll take a circle, draw it like this, and we'll replace a y here. And so now let's change this first circle to circles, and we'll give it that x value. But then if we don't know the y value yet, let's just say 50 for now. Okay, so we lost some of our circles, but we still have our first row. That's our 50. Okay, so now let's get this y. So with this y, what we're going to be able to do is just add another loop. But we want to add this to our main pattern so that it's affecting all of the circles, not just the first row. So what I can do here is put a new loop inside of the x loop. So I'll say for let y equals, and I'm just going to start out where this circle starts. So that's 50. And I'm going to go up until the last circle, which is 450. So say y is less than or equal to 450. And then each one of these y values is 100 apart. So 50 to 150 is 100, 150 to 250 is 100. So we'll just say y plus equals 100. So now what I have to be careful about is there's a bunch of code in here, but I want all of it to be inside of my my for loop. But I'm going to add it one bit at a time. So I'm going to get rid of this closing bracket and put a closing bracket here. And then I'm just going to move all this stuff in a little bit. And now I have this y value that I can put here. Okay, so now we have our circles back. And so this circles function uh, really just draws one circle because we're drawing our other circles down here. And so that's the next part that we're going to fix is that we're drawing each circle a bunch of times, but all we're doing is changing the size. So the first one is 100, the next one is 50, the next one is 25, and the last one is 10. And so they're almost all the same distance apart, although actually they kind of are a little bit 100. Okay, it starts at 100, then 50. Oh wait, where's second circle? It's here. 75. Okay, so that's minus 25. 50 is minus 25. 25 is minus 25. The last one is a little bit different. It's 10, so we might have a hard time with that one, but that's okay. So instead of creating a whole new function to add this group of circles, let's just make a loop inside of our circles function. And so we're just going to change the size. So we're going to say for, and so I'm doing size instead of position. So I'm going to say let s to stand for size. And we're starting at 100. So I'll say for let s equals 100. And then we're going to keep going until we hit the smallest amount, which is 10. So I'll say as long as, so a lot of code in here, but you're going to see in a second there, I'm going to get rid of almost all of it. Okay, so as long as s is greater than 10, so we're going down instead of up this time. So as long as s is greater than 10, we're going to subtract 25 from s, and then we're going to draw our circle. So I'll put my circle inside this for loop, and we'll change this to s. And so now this is actually going to be drawing all of our different sizes. So I can get rid of this whole second circle and it looks the same. I can get rid of the third circle. The only thing that's changing between these is the color, but I'm going to be able to change that in a second. Okay, so then the fifth circle. Okay, so the circle colors are just based on these random values and they're always the same. So we can do the same thing with these. I'm just going to move this whole section into here and get our random color there. So we're just setting the random color once before we draw the circle here. And now watch this. I'm going to delete all of this code. And we're going to get everything except for the smallest circle. And I think the green part will still work as well. Yeah. So look how much simpler this code is now. I don't need this one either. Now I have function pattern for let x equals 50. So we start at 50 over here. Let me do a drawing. So we start at x equals 50. That means right here. And as long as x is less than or equal to 400, so 400 is the width, so we're going to keep going across. X plus equals 100. That's the distance from here to here. So each one of these columns is 100 pixels. So then we say let y equals 50. So that's right here. And y is less than or equal to 450. That's our last row down here. And then y plus equals 100. So that's plus 100, plus 100, plus 100, plus 100. So that takes care of our grid for us. Then we're drawing circles at each xy. So each time we get to an xy, we're doing a new loop here. So inside of our circles function, so this circles function takes us up here with the xy for each one of our circles. And so for that xy, each time is right here. And now we're making a new loop that starts with size equals 100. So size equals 100 is the biggest size. And then we're subtracting 25 each time we go through the loop. So we choose a random color. So we get random red, random green, random blue, and we fill that in. So that's how we get all these random colors. And then we just draw our circle at the current xy and the current size. Then we loop back to the beginning. Size is minus equals 25, so that gives us this next size. And then we keep going. The only thing that we are going to have a hard time creating here is this last one, which is 10. So that maybe, there's probably a way to do that, but I think we don't need to go into that level of detail. We could change this parameter so you could get different numbers of circles. So if I said 10, I'm going to get a lot more circles. If I say 20, I'll get something different. So you could kind of play around with that. But so hopefully that kind of demonstrates what we had before was like these big blocks of code that were kind of like repeating a lot of stuff. But if we look at how to manipulate the code using our loops and our other things like our functions, we can separate all of this out and create slightly more efficient patterns. And that way we can, you can build from here without having to like scroll up and down and read lots of code. So that's kind of like what a lot of the different structures that we learn are used for. There's nothing technically wrong with having, a bunch of new functions to do similar things, but we can get much more robust programs and we can start to change things in simpler ways if we use these structures to kind of simplify what is the one parameter that's changing and how can I capture that with a loop or an if statement or a function or whatever it is. So synthesizing all of that stuff together takes time for sure. So I don't expect you guys to be able to do it, immediately. But hopefully, as we kind of introduce these new concepts and you try them in different contexts. So we'll look at we'll do a couple new versions of this next Monday in our next class. So we'll see this in a couple different contexts. Hopefully, once you see it being used in different ways, it'll start to make sense how you can apply it in different situations. Um, so I'm gonna save this one because I think this is a good example. So I'll just change this to updated pattern by Janae. And I'll just put updated by Roberts. And so I'll add both of these examples, although I want to get rid of this part. So I'll add both of these examples in the voice chat for you guys to take a look at. And yeah, let me